This was the third roundtable discussion on the London summit the Foreign Secretary has held with leading journalists from around the world. This time the countries represented were Turkey, Spain, South Africa and Australia.
Mr. Miliband, I'd like to ask you about a request from the Australian government which has called for another G20 summit this year to be held potentially in Asia and possibly South Korea as the host country. The Prime Minister in Australia suggests that there needs to be the momentum kept up. Is there a need for a third summit, do you think, and would you support and attend such a gathering?
Well, our Prime Minister Gordon Brown and the Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd have been working very closely together on these issues. We're absolutely at one with Prime Minister Rudd about the need for effective implementation and follow-up to any decisions that are taken on April the 2nd. Because as well as a very clear set of decisions, we need to make sure that the world puts them into practice. I think one of the things that Prime Minister Rudd has been stressing is that over the last 20 years, economics has gone global, but politics hasn't caught up. And the G20 summit represents an opportunity for the world to come together to try to take collective decisions about some vital economic issues, not just the financial regulation, but also the wider trade and development issues. And I very much hope, and we very much hope, that there will be effective follow-up. The precise form of the follow-up has to be discussed and agreed amongst the leaders, but I think that the determination of Prime Minister Rudd to make sure that the momentum isn't lost is absolutely right.
Aniska Smith from Media 24 newspapers. I was wondering, Mr. Miliband, whether the G20 countries can afford to continue lending its support to Africa, given that many of these countries face their own worst financial crisis.
I think it's very significant that this G20 meeting on April the 2nd shouldn't just be about the financial structures in the rich countries. It's also about the economic effects of financial market failure in the richer countries on the poorest people in the poorest countries. And that's why the agenda of this summit is in part a follow-up to the Washington summit's discussions of financial regulation. 47 different pieces of work were set in train in November. They need to be followed through in a very detailed way. But the agenda for this summit deliberately raises issues of macroeconomic coordination, issues of development, issues of trade, and issues of how we build a low-carbon recovery, because only a low-carbon recovery can be a sustainable recovery. And that's why I think that the poverty package, the anti-poverty package at the heart of this summit is a very important part of it. The leaders who are gathering will represent 85% of the world's income. And they have to make sure that they speak for 100% of the world's people, especially those in the poorest countries who, through no fault of their own, could end up suffering the greatest losses as a result of this economic crisis.
Fernando Buchol, I work for the Spanish news agency EFE. Mr. Miliband, do you think maybe the expectations on this summit have been set too high, that if we don't get a new Bretton Woods and we solve the world's problems, it's going to be a failure?
Well, I think that we've got to be idealistic and realistic at the same time. The truth is that the depth and breadth of this recession is greater than most people expected. It's challenging to our view of financial markets, but also to our conceptions about how you sustain economic growth. We've deliberately broadened the agenda for the summit to reflect the fact that we're living through an economic crisis, not just a financial crisis. But we've been careful not to raise undue expectations. And I say to you again, one conference on one day doesn't solve all the problems of the world. But what it can do is set a new direction and take concrete decisions that improve people's lives. And that, for us, is the test. Is it adequate to the times in which we live? And remember, Bretton Woods was a multi-year process. Bretton Woods wasn't just a one-day wonder. It was actually a long-term process born out of the horror of the Second World War. And we have to make sure that we take the right decisions on the 2nd of April to set the world on a different path.
The Foreign Secretary's discussions come just before finance ministers from the G20 group of countries meet in the UK this weekend, ahead of the London summit on April the 2nd.